everyone, welcome back to another episode of Hong Kong Horror. Simon here. Tonight, we're heading over to mainland China to cover a very strange incident that happened to a local man. Let's call him Larry. Larry's story is a terrifying account from when he was younger, after he fell extremely ill after a terrible accident. He came dangerously close to death, but according to Larry, a mysterious individual stepped in and saved his life in the most unexpected way imaginable. As always, after our story, let's break it down together from a Chinese cultural perspective to see if we can figure out exactly what happened here. So, turn on the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive right into this one. This incident happened years ago when Larry was in his early 20s. He grew up in the countryside of mainland China in a family that was extremely poor. Life was rough. Some days, his parents barely had enough food to put on the table. Larry admitted that growing up in these conditions definitely left scars on him mentally. Even though his parents have passed away and he's moved into the city as an adult, the fear of becoming poor again never truly left him. He eventually found work as a cab driver, and from that point onward, he became obsessed with saving money. In the back of his mind, he constantly feared that one day the work would suddenly dry up, or that he would lose everything and end up starving again like he did as a child. That fear consumed him. Larry worked all the time. He drove while he was sick. He skipped meals to save money. He hoarded every single cent he earned. Deep down, he knew the lifestyle was unhealthy, but he couldn't stop himself. To him, exhaustion felt safer than being broke. For an entire year, he worked without taking a single day off. Then, Chinese New Year approached. Many of Larry's friends and colleagues planned to travel back to their hometowns to reunite with family for the holidays. But when Larry calculated how much money he would lose by taking time off, he immediately changed his mind. Most of the other cab drivers would be returning home for the celebrations. If he stayed behind and kept working, business would be incredible. I mean, it's not like he had any family left anyways. He was just going to spend the new year with friends. But he called them and told them that he wouldn't be able to make it this year. Maybe next time, he promised. Maybe during Mid-Autumn Festival. Larry pushed himself even harder after that. Longer hours, less sleep, less food. He even kept empty bottles inside his cab so he wouldn't have to waste time stopping for bathroom breaks between passengers. Honestly, by that point, he was running on fumes. But every single time he saw money coming in, it pushed him to keep going. Until one night, after dropping off a passenger, his body finally gave out. He was driving home late at night, exhausted beyond belief. At some point during the drive, he briefly nodded off. It was only for a few seconds. The next thing he knew, his cab was tumbling down the side of a steep hill. Against all odds, Larry survived. When he finally opened his eyes again, he found himself lying in a hospital bed. His left arm was wrapped in a cast. His head was bandaged up. Every inch on his body hurt. A nurse noticed that he was awake and immediately went to get the doctor. When the doctor arrived, he told Larry bluntly that he was lucky to be alive. He had fallen asleep at the wheel, driven off the road, and rolled down the side of a cliff. His cab was completely destroyed. Larry had escaped with only a concussion and several broken bones. He would definitely need to remain under observation in the hospital for quite some time. For the first 2 days, Larry managed alright thanks to the pain medications. But on night number 3, something started happening. While drifting in and out of sleep, Larry suddenly realized he couldn't move. At first, he thought he was dreaming, but he was fully conscious. He could see the room around him clearly. He could even move his eyes, but the rest of his body refused to respond. It was sleep paralysis. Larry's heard of it before, but he's never actually experienced it in person until now. While he was struggling to regain control of his body, he noticed something standing in the doorway to his room, a dark, shadowy figure. The room itself was dark, but somehow this figure looked even darker than the darkness around it. Larry couldn't make out any details at first. It was just a pitch black silhouette of a person slowly approaching his bed. It stopped beside him for a few seconds. Then, without warning, it climbed directly onto the bed and violently pressed itself against Larry's chest, pinning him down. Larry felt the mattress sink in beneath the weight. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. He fought desperately to move, even just a finger, but his body remained completely frozen. Inside his mind, he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but in reality, he lay there in silence. This dark figure ignored his struggle completely. Slowly, it leaned in closer and closer until its face hovered just inches above Larry's. At first, the face was blurry. Then, details slowly began appearing. Larry was able to make out the facial features, and it was definitely a man. His expressionless eyes locked onto Larry's, and then, little by little, it started to smile. Larry was terrified now. Right when he thought he couldn't take this for another second, something else entered the room. Another figure emerged from the hallway. This time, it was a young woman. Unlike the shadowy man, Larry could see her clearly. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with long dark hair and pale skin. She looked around Larry's age. The most unsettling part was the way she moved. She wasn't walking like most of us, where we bob up and down as we walk. Her movement across the room was extremely smooth. Larry couldn't see her feet, but it reminded him of when someone rides on a scooter, extremely smooth from point A to point B. Without hesitation, she grabbed this shadowy man by the throat and violently ripped him off Larry's chest. The entire struggle happened in silence. Larry watched helplessly as this figure crashed to the floor before darting back into the hallway like a retreating shadow. The moment it disappeared, Larry jolted awake screaming. Pain immediately surged through his body. Nurses rushed into the room. Larry could barely explain what happened. Somehow, during the struggle, several of his stitches had reopened up and blood soaked through his bandages. The doctors had to stitch parts of him up all over again. But what worried them the most was that Larry's wounds weren't healing properly. They were actually getting worse and starting to get infected. Later that night, as he was laying there alone in the darkness, Larry couldn't shake the feeling that what he experienced wasn't simply just a nightmare. It was way too vivid. 3 more nights passed quietly, with nothing weird happening. Then, on the 4th night, it came back. Larry suddenly woke up in the middle of the night with this overwhelming sensation that someone was watching him. He opened his eyes. At the entrance of the room stood the same shadowy figure. This time, Larry could see its face more clearly. It was rotting and mangled. It was horrifying. Larry immediately felt that same helplessness. He was paralyzed again. The figure lingered by the entrance for a little bit, almost like it was hesitant to come in too quickly. After a while, it slowly drifted toward the bed again. But before it could reach him, the same beautiful young woman suddenly appeared again. She stepped directly between him and the shadowy man. Neither of them moved. They just stared at each other in silence for several long seconds before the shadowy figure drifted backwards again in retreat until it disappeared back into the dark hallway once again. Only after it left did this woman drift back toward the corner behind Larry's bed. Larry snapped awake, but by now, Larry no longer believed these were dreams. The same thing continued to happen night after night. The shadowy man would appear. Larry would become paralyzed whenever he came, and the mysterious woman would always arrive to drive him away before he could reach the bed. Meanwhile, Larry's physical condition kept going downhill. The infections spread aggressively through his injuries. Doctors placed him on heavy antibiotics, but nothing seemed to help. His fever climbed higher and higher. One day, the doctor entered the room with a grim expression. "Larry," he said quietly, "the infection is getting worse. If you have anything you want to say to your family, you should probably give them a call. Honestly, we're running out of options." Larry felt numb. After everything he sacrificed and worked so hard for, this was how he was going to die, alone in a hospital bed. That night, exhausted from crying, Larry eventually drifted off into a deep sleep. Sometime later, he woke to the sound of voices. It sounded like a crowded room full of people talking over one another. Confused, Larry opened his eyes. The hospital room was packed. At least 15 dark figures stood, scattered across the room, their bodies slowly forming out of what looked to be a faint black mist. They looked very similar to the shadowy man that had been visiting him every night. Larry isn't dumb. He knew what was going on. They came for him. He laid there, paralyzed, tears running down his face as these figures silently stared at him from every corner of the room. He just hoped that it would be quick and that he would get to see his parents again. But standing directly in front of his bed was the beautiful woman. Her arms hung stiffly at her sides as she blocked the figures from approaching him. For several long moments, neither side moved. Then, one by one, the shadowy figures slowly faded away into thin air. Larry stared at the woman in disbelief. He didn't know who she was or why she kept protecting him. Without even thinking, as he was slowly regaining control of his body again, he whispered softly, "Thank you." The woman suddenly turned toward him, her eyes wide with shock. You can actually see me?" she asked quietly. Larry weakly nodded. The woman looked down at him gently. "They're always around," she whispered. "They came because you're close to death. They want you." Deep down, Larry already knew she was telling the truth. Later that night, Larry felt his body growing numb. His thoughts slowed. An overwhelming sense of peace washed over him. For the first time in a long time, he genuinely felt ready to let go. He just wanted to close his eyes and go to sleep forever. He just felt so tired. But right before he drifted away completely, the woman suddenly appeared beside him again. This time, she grabbed him violently, shaking him awake. Hey, don't go to sleep yet. If you still want to live," she whispered urgently. "I can save you, but if I do this, you must promise to help me in return." Clinging desperately to life, Larry agreed immediately. What happened afterwards completely defied medical explanation. Within days, Larry's condition rapidly improved. The infections started disappearing, and his wounds were finally starting to heal. Even the doctors couldn't explain it. It was a miracle, as they called it. Not long after, he was discharged from the hospital. But despite returning to his normal life, Larry never forgot this promise he made to this woman. The strange thing was, she didn't appear again right away. Weeks passed, then months. Eventually, Larry started wondering if maybe the entire experience had really just been hallucinations caused by fever and medication. Until one night, she returned in a dream. Larry found himself standing in a quiet open field beneath the moonlight. This woman sat alone in the grass, as if she was waiting for him. This time, Larry wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt grateful to her. He walked over to her slowly and sat down beside her. The woman remained silent for a few moments before finally speaking. "I don't have much time left here," she said softly. Then she gave Larry an address. He didn't recognize it at all. It was somewhere far outside the city. "Please, repeat it until you memorize it," she told him. "In 2 days' time, please go there." Larry had countless questions, but she stopped him before he could speak. "Please," she whispered. "It's the only thing I ask of you. I finally found them. You'll find a little girl there. Please help her." Before Larry could respond, this woman slowly began to fade away into the night. Larry woke up and hurried to write the address down before he forgot it. The next morning, instead of going to work, Larry drove straight toward the location. The address led him far outside the city, deep into a remote village. Eventually, he arrived at a small, isolated house. As Larry approached the front door, he could already hear screaming from inside, a woman yelling and a child crying. Larry hesitated for just a second. What exactly was he even supposed to say? A ghost told me to come here? Still, a promise was a promise, so he knocked. A middle-aged man opened the door. "What do you want?" he snapped. While trying to think of an excuse for why he was there, Larry suddenly noticed a woman inside aggressively hitting a little girl. Larry couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Hey, stop that! She's just a child!" The man immediately shoved Larry backwards and slammed the door in his face. Furious, Larry drove to the nearest payphone and called the police. Since he was afraid they wouldn't take the situation seriously, he exaggerated slightly and claimed that he suspected a kidnapping. He had no idea why he made this extreme story up, but it worked. The police arrived quickly, and as it turned out, Larry wasn't entirely wrong. The man was the little girl's biological father, but the abusive woman inside was her stepmother. The girl's real mother, a woman named Nina, had died 8 months ago in the very same hospital where Larry had nearly lost his life. According to what Larry later learned, Nina had suffered from congestive heart failure. Her husband's affair devastated her emotionally, and her health went downhill rapidly afterwards. Before she died, Nina's parents tried fighting for custody of the little girl, believing that her father had no real interest in raising her anyways. Instead of giving her up, however, he disappeared with his new girlfriend and the child to a remote village where nobody could find them. For 8 months, the girl had been trapped there, enduring abuse from her stepmother. When police rescued her, she was covered in bruises. Eventually, she was reunited with her grandparents. After that incident, Larry never saw that beautiful woman again. He believes that was Nina. She never came to see him anymore, not even in his dreams. Still, deeply disturbed by everything that he experienced, he eventually visited a temple and told an elderly Buddhist monk the entire story. The old monk listened quietly before sighing. "Young man," he said softly, "trying to untangle the deeper knots of karma will only drive a person mad. Knowing the full truth will not benefit the living." He looked at Larry carefully. "Treat your survival as a sacred gift. Live the rest of your life with virtue and honor the life that was returned to you." Larry never forgot those words. From that day onward, he stopped living the way he used to. He no longer worked himself to exhaustion chasing money. He started visiting temples regularly and became much more spiritual. He's by no means a rich man, but sometimes, when he had a slightly better month at work, he donates a little bit of money to monks so that they can offer prayers to Nina. He also prays for her himself in hopes that his chants will bring her eternal peace in the afterlife. Larry rarely tells this story to other people because he knows most people would call him crazy or lying. But after everything he went through, he's learned that other people's opinions don't really matter anymore. So, Hong Kong horror family, what do you think happened here to Larry? Please, pause the video here and let me know what you think in the comments below. Alright, so let's break the story down from a Chinese cultural perspective. This whole situation that happened to Larry, to me, is not just a simple ghost encounter or hallucination caused by fever. I don't believe that he imagined any of what he saw, because a lot of what he describes is very similar to many other stories of others who have gone through similar experiences. Larry was in a liminal state between life and death, where the boundary between the human world and the spirit world temporarily became thin enough for him to perceive things that most people can't. I think that one of the most important concepts in understanding the story is yang-he, or yang energy. In traditional Chinese belief, all of us, as living humans, carry a balance of energies, but strong yang energy is associated with vitality, warmth, consciousness, and protection from harmful spiritual influences. When someone becomes severely weakened physically or emotionally, their yang-he, yang energy, can begin collapsing. This is especially believed to happen through prolonged exhaustion, starvation, grief, illness, trauma, or isolation. Larry had been destroying himself before the accident even happened. What is culturally important is that he was not just working hard, he was working too hard to the point where I would say he had crossed into obsession with work and making money. Chinese culture traditionally places enormous importance on balance. A person is expected to work hard, yes, but they're also expected to rest and do other things as well, like nourish themselves properly and do things that make you happy, like seeing friends and family during Chinese New Year. Larry rejected all of that. During a period meant for reunion and renewal, he isolated himself entirely in pursuit of money because of the fear that poverty would return. Fear and obsession can gradually distort a person's spirit. There's a concept called tamnim, which refers to consuming greed or fixation. It does not necessarily mean evil greed in the Western sense that we're used to. In Larry's case, it comes from childhood trauma and survival instinct. But culturally, once a person becomes psychologically consumed by fear and attachment, they begin damaging themselves spiritually as well as physically. By the time Larry crashed his cab, he was already in a state many older Chinese people describe as half-detached from ordinary life. Then came the accident itself, which then later brought on a series of things like severe trauma, blood loss, fever, infection, having to take lots of medication, and prolonged hospitalization. All of these things are traditionally viewed as conditions that weakens the barrier between living and the dead. Hospitals are usually considered very spiritually heavy places because they always have a concentrated yang-he, yin energy, associated with sickness, suffering, death, and decay. This is why many traditional Chinese people feel uneasy about having to stay overnight at hospitals. The belief is not necessarily that hospitals are haunted, but that they exist close to the boundary between worlds because so many people die there. It's a place where yin energy always accumulates, which might explain why a lot of strange occurrences happen at hospitals. So, what are the shadow figures that Larry encountered in the hospital? These resemble something we call yamwan, wandering yin spirits, or death-associated entities, drawn towards someone whose life force is fading. Their behavior is extremely important. They don't immediately attack him violently. Instead, they gather, observe, and linger. From a traditional perspective, this resembles the belief that spirits become aware when a person is nearing death. Someone whose life force is unstable can begin attracting things from the yin realm, almost like a lantern attracting insects in the dark. They're drawn to this. This is where it gets much more complicated than the simple idea of ghosts. Larry saw a whole bunch of different shadowy figures, but they're not all the same type of entities. Western horror often treats spirits as one broad category, but Chinese cosmology historically divides the dead into many different states of existences, depending on things like how they died, whether proper funeral rites were performed, their emotional condition at death, their karma, and whether they successfully transitioned into the afterlife. So, when I use the term Yum-One, I'm talking broadly about yin-based spiritual remnants connected to death and the afterlife. But culturally, people might interpret Larry's figures in several overlapping ways. One interpretation is that they were wandering dead, attracted to weakening life force. The boundary between life and death is not sealed shut, it's porous. A person approaching death is thought to emit signs spiritually, kind of like a fading flame. There's an old idea that when a person's yang-hei, their life-giving yang energy, weakens enough, entities from the yin realm begin noticing them naturally. This is when you often hear older Chinese traditions describe dying people as beginning to see deceased relatives or speak to unseen visitors. The belief is that the soul is beginning to loosen from the body, and once that happens, the person no longer exists fully in this world of the living anymore. They're starting to cross over, having a foot in the yin realm already. This overlap is what likely attracts the figures. But what exactly were they doing there? This is where interpretations differ, depending on whether you approach the story from folk religion, Taoist belief, Buddhist influence, or regional superstition. Spirits are not necessarily hunting souls aggressively, the way demons might in Western beliefs. Instead, death itself is viewed as a process governed by cosmic order. There are even legendary underworld officials associated with escorting souls after death. If you recall from past episodes, such as Ao Ma Min, Oxhead and Horseface, whose role is to guide or collect souls when their lifespan ends. Larry's shadowy figures do not resemble formal underworld officials. I would say that they behave more like opportunistic yin entities, drawn toward death. It's important to point out that the underworld officials do not show up in crowds like this, where they just linger and watch. These are scavengers. There's a very old Chinese folk idea that places saturated with death can attract spiritually hungry beings. Some traditions describe certain spirits as becoming addicted to feeding off fear, illness, grief, or energetic instability surrounding death. This is one of the reasons why hospitals are usually a hotspot. This overlaps somewhat with the concept of all quiet or hungry ghosts, though Larry's entities seem more intelligent and composed than the chaotic suffering usually associated with hungry ghosts. A useful way to think about it culturally is this. When a person is healthy and spiritually stable, their yang energy forms a kind of natural boundary to protect them. But when someone is near death, that shield comes down. The person becomes spiritually exposed. To yin entities, such a person may appear almost like they're glowing. This is why the metaphor of a lantern in the darkness is so fitting. The fading life force draws these entities in. Some traditions even believe spirits gather because they're waiting for the exact moment the soul separates from the body. Not necessarily to steal it in a simplistic sense, but because transitional moments between life and death are believed to create enormous spiritual disturbance. In Chinese cosmology, these moments of transition are extremely powerful. Birth, death, funerals, severe illness, they're all considered spiritually volatile states. Now, why would these entities gather around for death? The answer depends on what kind of entities these spirits are. Wandering spirits are drawn instinctively toward death because they themselves exist in a liminal state. They're already beings suspended between worlds, so they naturally gravitate toward places and people where the veil is thin. They're not necessarily malicious. Think of it as them simply responding to spiritual gravity. A dying person emits an enormous amount of yin energy, and yin beings are naturally drawn toward it. But there are darker reasons too. There are certain yin entities that benefit from lingering near death because the moment of soul separation releases an enormous amount of spiritual disturbance. So imagine the soul separating from the body, not as a gentle floating away, but as a collapse of the bond holding consciousness to physical existence. It's more like a rupture, and viewed as spiritually violent and chaotic. This is one reason why funerals and death rituals are treated so carefully in Chinese culture. Rituals are meant to stabilize the transition so that the soul does not become lost and that wandering entities do not interfere. Without proper transition, the dead risk becoming spiritually distorted themselves. Now, regarding how this benefits the entities, they like to gather because a weakened human life force can temporarily strengthen or even nourish many of them. So this is not necessarily meaning they literally eat souls. Chinese ghost lore is usually a lot less direct than that. Instead, prolonged exposure to fear, illness, despair, and dying energy is believed to reinforce yin-heavy entities because these conditions resonate with their own nature. Certain folk beliefs explains that not all wandering spirits are harmless observers. Some are believed to deliberately accelerate the decline and weaken the people. There are stories throughout Chinese culture about bedridden individuals rapidly getting worse after repeated paranormal encounters, especially during long illnesses. The idea is that some yin entities feed off weakening yang energy the way parasites feed off weakened hosts. I think this is very likely why Larry's condition kept worsening despite treatment. His wounds weren't healing originally. Notice something very important in this story. Larry becomes paralyzed specifically whenever these figures approach. This is spiritually significant because extreme yin presence suppresses yang vitality. Paralysis, numbness, coldness, mental fog, and exhaustion are all associated with overwhelming yin influence. So the sleep paralysis is Larry's life force being temporarily overpowered whenever they came close. Now, let's talk about the spirit of Nina. Her presence disrupts the other entity's process repeatedly, which is extremely rare and unusual. Because, from a traditional perspective, once the yin realm begins claiming someone close to death, ordinary ghosts usually do not interfere. Nina's ability to hold them back suggests to me a few possibilities. She's an extraordinary spiritual force born from Zapnim, unresolved attachment, or that Larry's lifespan was not actually meant to end yet. The shadowy entities may have sensed Larry hovering on the edge but not fully there yet, which would explain why they kept coming back to check on him to see if that boundary collapsed yet. So, Nina does not behave like a typical ghost. Most ghost stories involve spirits driven by revenge, bitterness, confusion, or maybe even hunger. But Nina? She behaves more like a protective entity. Yet, even that description is incomplete, because ordinary spirits are generally not believed capable of driving away multiple entities. The deeper explanation likely lies in the concept of Zapnim, which refers to an overpowering, unresolved attachment or fixation that persists even after death. Under normal folk belief, a newly deceased spirit like Nina should not have the amount of power in the yin realm over other entities, but spirits are not all equal. After death, a spirit's state is shaped by a combination of factors: the manner of death, emotional intensity at the moment of death, unresolved obligations, and most importantly, the strength of Zapnim, which is an intense, binding emotional fixation that prevents proper release from the human world. If you think about it, Nina's death is emotionally extreme. She dies from heart failure that's directly tied to grief, betrayal, and the collapse of her family structure. Also, she dies while her child is still alive and in danger. This creates one of the strongest possible forms of attachment a spirit can carry, because it's not just sadness or resentment. It's a protective, maternal responsibility that has no resolution at the time of death. This form of attachment can function almost like a source of post-mortem strength. A spirit that has no attachment is expected to gradually move on, but a spirit with a powerful unresolved purpose can remain anchored to the human world with unusual stability. So, in simpler terms, Nina's presence is not necessarily strong in the sense of raw spiritual power. She is strong in the sense of cohesion, her identity as a mother, and her unresolved responsibility toward her daughter gave her a very clear direction in the spiritual sense. In contrast, the shadow figures in Larry's hospital are described more wandering spirits associated with yamhei or yin energy tied to death and dissolution. They're not individualized spirits with a strong identity or purpose. They behave more like a collective presence responding to a dying person's weakening life force. A focused spirit with a strong identity and clear emotional anchor can sometimes resist or even overpower more amorphous yin influences like these. Nina is not competing with them in terms of force in a physical sense. She's essentially imposing her will and attachment into the space, creating a boundary defined by intent. Also, because Nina died in the same hospital where Larry is being treated, the story implicitly places her within the same death field or yin environment. So Nina is therefore not entering unfamiliar territory. She's already attached to that space through her own death experience. That can make her presence even more stable compared to the wandering entities that could have been simply drawn in externally. When she confronts the shadow figures, what she is really doing is not overpowering them through superior spiritual rank. She's actually more so asserting a concentrated, emotional absolute intention that interrupts this pull of the dying process. It's important to note that she can't maintain this indefinitely. Attachment is powerful, but it's not sustainable forever. Even strong Zapnim will eventually weaken once its purpose is fulfilled. When Larry survives and the child is rescued, Nina's reason for remaining active in the human realm disappears. At that point, her strength is no longer reinforced by unresolved necessity, and she will naturally fade away. So in short, Nina's not powerful because she's dominant over the other entities. She's structurally different from them. They're different types of spirits. Spirits are often thought to remain in the human realm because they can't let go of something emotionally powerful. Sometimes it's hatred, sometimes it's revenge, or it could be guilt. But one of the strongest forms of Zapnim is believed to be maternal attachment. Nina's daughter was still suffering terribly after her death. She had died knowing that her child was trapped with abusive people and completely unprotected. Emotions that intense can bind a spirit to the earthly realm because the soul cannot rest peacefully while its greatest responsibility remains unresolved. This may explain why Nina retained enough presence and force to protect Larry. But I don't think that Nina saved Larry purely out of compassion. She may have needed him. This is where the story starts resembling a concept called jamming or borrowing life. There are many stories involving fate and lifespan being altered temporarily through supernatural intervention. Sometimes, a person survives when they should have died because another force intervenes, but these interventions almost always involve an exchange. Nina specifically tells Larry that she can save him if he agrees to help her in return. That exchange is spiritually significant. It almost feels as though Nina recognized that Larry exists in a rare condition where he could still be pulled back from death. He was on the edge between worlds. If she could preserve his life long enough for him to recover, he could become the instrument to which her daughter was finally rescued. In other words, Larry may have survived because his remaining life became tied temporarily to Nina's unresolved purpose. Do you remember when Nina said, "You can actually see me"? Nina's surprise implies to me that most living people can't see her. Larry could only do so because he himself was hovering near death. Once Nina's daughter was rescued, Nina never appeared to Larry again. That detail carries enormous weight culturally. In Buddhist-influenced Chinese belief, attachment is what binds beings to suffering and prevents them from moving on peacefully. Once her daughter was safe, Nina's deepest attachment may have finally been resolved. there was no longer any reason for her to remain in the human world. This connects to the concept of fongha, meaning to let go. Letting go is viewed not as abandonment, but as spiritual release. In Buddhism, the universe is considered far too complex for ordinary people to fully understand spiritually. Trying to map every supernatural event can lead a person into obsession and suffering. The monk essentially tells Larry that details don't really matter as much as what he chooses to do with the life that was returned to him. Larry's true sickness was never just physical. It was spiritual exhaustion born from fear, trauma, and obsession. The near-death experience forced him into a direct confrontation with mortality, suffering, karma, attachment, and even compassion. He entered the hospital, terrified of becoming poor and dying alone. But he came back out, understanding something much larger than just money. In many ways, the story resembles a spiritual rebirth. He survived, not because he won against death, but because another suffering soul briefly held the door closed long enough for him to change the course of both of their fates. Thank you, Hong Kong Horror family, for making it to this point of the story. I hope you all enjoyed this one. Until we speak again next week, stay safe and good night.